If you've been on the internet in the past 6 years, you've already heard of incels and the red pill. You know who they are. Involuntarily celibate, mostly guys commiserating online about how much it sucks to be unable to have sex or form intimate relationships with another person. If that doesn't sound so bad to you on the surface, I understand. After all, in the most basic sense of the term, most people are incels at one point in their life or another. You may have noticed that sexual frustration, especially in your younger years, is sort of the default setting in the human experience. No, the problem isn't that these people can't get laid and are upset about it. It's the adoption of a worldview that fosters horrible, horrible misogyny. This ideology, if we can call it that, has manifested itself in the real world in the form of actual tragedies. Just a quick note before we continue. I'm not a trained psychologist, anthropologist, or philosopher. I'm an enthusiastic layman, and anything I say should be interpreted as such. With that out of the way, let's proceed. By now, there are more subgenres of incel than there are subgenres of rock music, so to speak about them all as a monolith would be a little disingenuous. They are not all dangerous, and they are not all misogynistic. Still, I'm not particularly interested in going on and on about how bad these guys are, or why the things they think are bad, per se. Misogyny bad is too obvious to warrant any discussion. No, in this essay, I want to talk about a particular part of the incel ideology that I think contributes to the reduction of women and people at large to fleshy automatons, and while the consequences are severe, one of the causes, I think, is as simple as a logical mistake that seems to be everywhere in the reductive grossness, which is the manosphere. I'm talking about the kind of thinking that points to evolutionary psychology to explain why women, or more broadly, people in general, act the way they do. You've probably heard someone say something like this. Women. They want an alpha male, a provider, someone with a huge club who can protect them from other guys and put food on the table. Think about it. No cave woman wants a caveman who can't hunt or gets beat up by cave chads. They are evolutionarily built to prefer the cave chad. That's also why women prefer to stay home, because back in caveman days, they used to stay home and pick berries while the men hunted. Feminism is trying to ruin all that. Sound familiar? These sorts of rationalizations of social norms almost always place the origin of behavior somewhere in the Pleistocene and come up with a singular, just so explanation of why that behavior evolved. One problem with these sorts of interpretations is that, generally, science is unequipped to answer why. It is very effective at telling us how or what, but why remains the domain of philosophy. Another problem with these interpretations is that behaviors don't fossilize. Genetic and archaeological evidence can tell us a great deal about human populations in prehistory, but the ideas behind their behavior, preferences, and culture, as well as the causal mechanisms of those behaviors, are mostly obscure. The red pill interpretation of prehistory seems to acknowledge a singular successful reproductive strategy, and that's it. It ignores that there are so many different ways to be reproductively successful, and they don't all follow the model of big man gets all the cave girls. For all the information we have about early modern human social organization, we can only guess how their societies really worked in a broad sense, such as the presence of social stratification and personal property. That is essentially the problem. Subscribers to the just-so explanations of modern behavior and preferences assume they have their roots in our evolutionary and therefore biological past, making them more or less determinative. In the case of those who can't get laid, the explanation is that they can't get laid because women are a certain way. And this is just how it is, goddammit. It ignores the reality that human cultures, just like the cultures of our prehistoric ancestors and close evolutionary relatives, is complex and malleable. In that sense, it is not that people are a certain way, but that given certain criteria, they can be a certain way. The diversity of cultural norms relating to, well, everything through history is evidence of that. Maybe where they get hung up is the differences in the sex lives of our non-human relatives. As anyone who has taken an introductory anthropology class can tell you, sexual behaviors in morphology and primates vary widely based on ecological circumstances. For example, gorillas have evolved dramatic sexual dimorphism, with males being way bigger than females, so they can fight off the other males or predators who may want to mate with or eat their harem. The male gorilla, thus enabled, mates with the females in his protection. By the way, whatever the opposite of a fun fact is, here's one. I can't remember exactly where I read or heard this, but apparently, a pregnant gorilla will naturally terminate her pregnancy if a new silverback rolls up in her range without the father around to protect her. Since the intruding male would kill the infant on sight anyway, she's just saving herself the resources that would have gone into the development of the fetus. On the flip side of the sexual dimorphism spectrum are gibbons. There are species of gibbons with such little sexual dimorphism that telling males and females apart is quite difficult. In sharp contrast to gorillas, some gibbons are polygonandrous, meaning both males and females have multiple partners. The male gibbons don't know who their offspring are, so resources are shared communally, ensuring all infants are provided for by the group. This gives rise to a chicken or the egg dilemma. Did gibbons' social structure, one where males and females act pretty much the same, come about as a result of their biology? Or did their biology develop as a result of a lack of selective pressure for larger males? Back to the gorillas. Are they polygynous because the males are bigger? Or are they bigger because of natural selection weeding out gorillas who couldn't fight off a leopard, only leaving females to mate with the males who didn't become cat food? I strongly suspect in both cases that these factors and consequences are cyclical. Let's come back to humans, who are subject to the same cyclical factors and consequences. We are sexually dimorphic, though not to the same extent as gorillas, with males being, on average, larger than females, your mother being a notable exception. In most societies today, people have one reproductive partner at a time, again, your mother being an exception to the rule. Red pill types have observed this and carry it forward to say that since males are bigger and more naturally aggressive, these tendencies should be encouraged and enhanced in order to more closely align with what I can only describe as some sort of naturalistic, sexually binary utopia, where if everyone only behaved in accordance with their biological nature, the world would be a better place. Accordingly, as the binary opposite of men, women should be submissive and nurturing. I haven't heard many interpretations that would carry forward gorilla-esque polygyny into the way humans ought to be, but they might be out there. If I'm going to steelman this argument, it would be something like this. We have, being exposed to the culture we live in, as well as history, a fairly good idea about how human beings naturally form into societies. The way things are today is a natural consequence, and since we and everything we do is the result of biological and cultural evolution, following nature is in our best interest, as this is a system that works. I'm not completely unsympathetic to this argument. In my last essay, I talked about how living according to one's nature instead of a social prescription was in line with ancient Stoic philosophy, and I feel strongly that knowing oneself is a prerequisite to happiness and finding out how you ought to live. However, I find an appeal to nature can also be interpreted and applied to making social prescriptions, rather than liberating people from them. I get that we need rules as a society, almost by definition, but how many of these are needlessly limiting? I had a conversation with someone recently who said, "Don't get me started on feminists. They think that women should be men." I think this entirely misses the point. Yes, men and women are different on average. Men are more naturally inclined towards some things than women, and vice versa. The problem is in the prescription. We do not live in the Pleistocene environment our ancestors evolved in. Even if we are programmed that way, given the last 10,000 years of sedentary lifestyle, is it not more likely and fair to say that our social interactions are more finely attuned towards a life in small agricultural communities? Further, to call it programming implies that it's static and that behaviors can't be learned. Human brains, and therefore society, are malleable. You can see this in the diversity of cultures that exist, but also in how quickly non-human primates adapt to mimic certain human behaviors. Have you ever seen that video of the orangutan driving the golf cart? That video rules. In post-industrial society, we live in a world of superabundance. Even people who are starving are not starving in the literal sense, that is, to death. In the Pleistocene, that was not the case. The practice of cannibalism to postpone starvation in the archaeological record is evidence of that. Even the proverbial starving children of Africa did not go so far as to resort to cannibalism. Still, people in post-industrial society have resorted to cannibalism, such as in the siege of Stalingrad. But examples like that are massive exceptions to the rule that agriculture, especially diversified and global industrial agriculture, works really well. All that being the case, what need do we have for evolutionary software that was designed for an entirely different environmental context? An argument might be that it is impossible or dangerous for us to overcome our nature, regardless of our situation. With regard to the possibility, the issue is again in defining what our nature is, and I would be wary of anyone making blanket claims about what human nature is. With regard to danger, I would contend that the influence of technology and industrialization has put us in an economic situation where our nature, if that is truly what it is a redundant safety mechanism. Unless something goes seriously wrong, you will not starve to death. The odds of you being killed by a predator are vanishingly small. We are no longer in a mortal struggle for survival. We have, at least in middle-class post-industrial societies, transcended the need for limiting social prescriptions on human beings that have their roots in our physical survival. I suspect that that wolf is not, in fact, at the door. To take just one target of this kind of thinking, it isn't a matter of feminism or anti-feminism. When you prescribe how a class of human beings ought to act, you're placing a limit on human liberty as a whole. If you're a woman, so what? If you're a man, so what? Prescribing how men and women ought to be denies them their individuality for the sake of a system that is for all intents and purposes extinct. We are making human sacrifices to dead gods. Our discussion of various primate groups shows just how many different social systems can be employed, depending on the situation. I'm not saying anything I discussed is the way forward, only that there are so many possibilities when it comes to how truly liberated individuals could live in a society where death and starvation are not ever-pressing concerns. Maybe we really are still limited by insufficient technology and social structures. Maybe that limit is entirely psychological. Returning to incels and the red pill for a final consideration, listen, I get it. Being unable to get laid sucks. Not having anyone be interested in a romantic relationship with you sucks. I think most people, regardless of current relationship or celibacy status, have felt that way at one time or another. There's no getting around that it is normal to want those things. But I hope I made it clear that, at least intellectually, there can't be so much stock put into evolutionary psychology as an explanation of why people act the way they do, why women want precisely what they want, and why that might disqualify you from the kinds of interactions you may want from them. It is so tempting to want to know why things are the way they are. It feeds into a romantic fatalism that allows you to rot in righteous and delicious self-pity. But it's not science. It's not even good philosophy. It's cheap, and any conclusions you draw are only ever going to be as good as your best guess.